Here's the thing, I'm so bad at PowerPoint. There is no PowerPoint. Hurrah, you see. No, I'm not. I was just talking to Clay. I'm so bad at it that I'm not going to use it. So that's the thing. First of all, hello, and thank you very much indeed for asking me. And thank you to Chris Sexton, who, if you don't like what I've got to say, it's entirely her fault because she asked me. The second thing is that I don't know whether other feedback forms, that's the important thing to oh, Lord. I can't bear these things. I did a conference about last week, and there's a pile of them, and I checked them on the way out. And somebody had written next door to my contribution, they said, if I only had an hour left to live in my life, I'd want to spend it listening to a speech by Simon Fanshawe. I thought, well, hurrah. So I turned, there's an asterisk, and I turned to the continuation page, and they'd written, because it would seem like eternity. So I very much hope you don't feel like that by the time I get to the end. I always say I don't mind people looking at their watches while I'm speaking, but it always pisses me off that they start to tap them to see if they're still working. So that would be good if you could not do that. And of course, you know, it's great in a way to be. I'm not illiterate in IT terms, but I'm kind of a bit of a lagger. You know, it takes me a while to catch up. You know, and so I'm kind of intrigued by the whole metadata, big data, Edward Snowden, all this kind of stuff at the moment. And I'm finding kind of it's an interesting sea in which to swim around. But we're just about we're just about to do some work at GCHQ. For reasons which I won't bother to explain, but there's a good route that leads to it. So the other day I had to ring the woman at GCHQ who is responsible for booking us. And I rang GCHQ, and if you do this, the number's quite public, there's a recorded message that says, hello and welcome to GCHQ. Your phone call may be recorded for lawful purposes. I said, I really think you ought to check this out. You know, I think this is not self-conscious enough. Just to say about Fanshawe, we are a consultancy that myself and a colleague, Roy Hutchins, we work with companies. We use diversity and difference as a way of supporting companies and organisations to transform themselves. So we work with groups of leaders, we work with executives, SMGs, all that kind of stuff. We work with whole organisations, and Chris and I met, in fact, in the first phase of a big programme that we're doing at Sheffield University. So we work with a number of universities. We've done programmes at the Glasgow School of Art, Sheffield University, Edinburgh University, Sussex. So from big to small, really. In terms of my relationship with higher education, it's not just a relationship as working as a consultant, if you like, but it's also that for 6 years until last July, I was the chairman of the University of Sussex's Governing Council. It's also the university that I went to. So a lot of my understanding of higher education comes from that process of transformation, both in the teaching, learning and research, and also in the governance at Sussex University that we did during that period. And, you know, while we're here and I've got you captive and you can't move, I might as well tell you that student numbers increased by 25%, overall income by 140%, student satisfaction went up into the 80s, surpluses are now regularly 4, 5, 6, 7%. And income, research income went up by 39%. So, we did a kind of good job of getting Sussex's mojo back, which is a matter of enormous satisfaction, you know, because it was a place that changed my life. And that's the thing about universities, they change your lives. It's also great, I'm a long-term resident of Brighton. I came to Sussex to live here. And so it's wonderful to welcome to Brighton just a conference of such size and significance, and that's always a pleasure for those of us that live here to have you guys come and visit and discover what a fabulous place it is. As I say, I came to Sussex, which was in its last real, I think, flow of radicalism in the late 70s, 75, 78, you know, when we actually did real politics, and we did all sorts of amazing things. I remember my favourite thing is we occupied the refectory to bring an end to apartheid. Well, don't laugh, it worked. Not a day goes by that Nelson Mandela didn't used to say, thank God the refectory is named after me. And we were very, it is and was a brilliant place. And, but we invented the plough person's lunch. That was one of our other contributions. So these are important things that I think we brought to the radical tradition of universities. And, of course, Brighton is a wonderful place. You'll have discovered it last night. I noticed it said something like informal evening or some such. My favourite remark was Keith Waterhouse, the great columnist who lived here for many, many years, used to say of Brighton, the great thing about Brighton is that you can buy your lover a pair of knickers on Victoria Station and have them off again in under half an hour in the Grand Hotel. So, and I'm sure some of you will have experienced that over the last couple of days. He once told, actually, he once said that Brighton it was a place that looked like it was helping the police with their inquiries. You know, so welcome to our wonderful and raffish city. The higher education context, we are in this extraordinary period, exciting period, challenging period of immense volatility. And I think there's two things that are worth mentioning, particularly at this point. I mean, one is now the decision to deregulate student numbers completely by 2015. And then the contradictory, and apparently left hand doesn't know what the right hand is doing, fact that the fees system is almost broke. You'll have noticed recently in response to some parliamentary questions, particularly by Liam Byrne, that the system is almost at the stage now where it makes less money for the Treasury and the government and therefore for higher education than it did when the fees were £3,000. And the reason for that is that the incredible rise in outstanding payments. So we're now almost at that threshold, which is 48.6% of debts unpaid. We're round about the 45% mark. So we're in this peculiar situation, as we were indeed with immigration, whereas on the one hand, BIS were telling us that we all had to go out and recruit overseas students as much as we possibly can, and then the Home Office was saying, don't you dare bring foreign people in here, because they'll all stay and take jobs and, you know, take our boyfriends and girlfriends and stay here and be productive in the economy, but we don't want them. So we've got a bit of a crisis here, and it's quite interesting that if you, I mean, Adrian Bailey, who's chair of the business committee at the Commons, said, you know, we're in fiscal meltdown. But I think, I mean, he would say that, wouldn't he, because he's a Labour MP. But maybe more interestingly was Nick Hillman, who's now who leads HEPI, the Higher Education Policy Institute, said that the government have obviously got their sums wrong, which, you know, you might expect the head of the Higher Education Policy Institute to say that had he not been David Willetts's advisers when they raised the fees to £9,000. So this is a man on the road to Damascus. But why do I mention now these? Well, of course, I mention it because this is going to potentially to have a profound effect on the level of investment in higher education. And we don't know which way it's going to fall. We also don't know the way in which deregulation at that level will fall. If you remember back to AAB being deregulated, it fell in the most peculiar ways, where Southampton University, for instance, lost considerable numbers of students, you know, not through any fault of their own. They're an absolutely fantastic university, but for whatever reason they didn't get the calculation right. Exeter made up students, Sussex pretty much kept its target. It fell very unequally. What is the government's ultimate aim, and what do you think is most likely to happen? My suspicion is that the government's ultimate aim is to concentrate investment and research, as they've done with research policy, in fewer universities. So there'll be fewer universities, and they will be bigger, which means that some of you will be working in institutions which in the next few years will go bankrupt. And they will not be here any longer, and they will be merged, or they will be eaten up, or they will in some way be transferred into something else. That is a potential outcome of that level of deregulation. It won't be that fast, but the signs will start to appear. We don't know exactly how that's going to fall. And, you know, those are going to be serious questions for us. And so it's really in the context of that I thought it would be worth thinking about sort of four things, really. But I did just want to say something about what I think, what role you guys occupy, men and women, in universities. I think there was a time when yourselves and the directors of estates were sort of told by the academic management, well, this is the strategy, so pop off and implement it, would you mind? And I don't think you're in that position any longer. I think you are now clearly leaders. And you're leaders for a number of reasons. Firstly, because common sense would indicate that you should be. And secondly, that if you look, for instance, at the kind of priorities you've set yourselves, I mean, the three priorities that I understand are the key areas of concern for yourselves at the moment, which is the effective use of technology for learning, teaching and research, institutional modernisation, and also IT consumerism, the kinds of things that you were talking about right at the end about the boys watching the Super Bowl. I mean, those are your challenges across those five operational bits of the university, which is teaching, learning, research, admin, commercialisation, internationalisation. You know, those are your priorities, and they clearly sit absolutely centrally in the quality of the university experience, not just now, but in how we develop the ability of institutions to withstand the kind of volatility and thrive within the context of the kind of volatility that I've described. So I think you need to think maybe about, we need to think, I think, about four things really in this. The first is this question about making a case for the universities to the public. Universities are not universally seen either as a priority for the British public, nor are they necessarily seen as particularly valuable by the British public. Partly because 60% of the British public don't perceive universities as an aspirational possibility for their children. 40% of kids in universities in the country go to universities. 60% don't. So a majority of parents do not have that as one of the possible aspirations for their kids. So they've always felt, I think, that they're being asked to pay for another group of people to take advantage of this. So the only way, it seems to me, to advocate the case for universities to the British public, quite apart from the economic impact and the way in which universities impact both on the civility of the society and also the economic success of the society, has got to be to continue widening participation, and at all costs to defend and extend widening participation. And there's been incredible changes. If you think back, it's 50 years since Robbins now, and if you think back to, when people went to university then, when it was 8, 9, 10%, and now it's pushing 40. Incredible strides, an extraordinary journey. But it's not there yet, because we're still, to some extent, supersaturating the middle classes. That 40% is still not necessarily made up of as thoroughgoing a social mix as it should be. And that seems to me absolutely crucial. And IT clearly plays a part in that. It clearly plays a part in how you reach out to people, how you are able to give people access to courses, by making them part-time, by making them distance learning, and so on and so forth. IT is clearly very important as a tool in that advocacy of the importance of universities. The second thing, I think, is making universities relevant. It's a sort of factor of making them important to the whole society, but it's also about saying, how do universities really make an impact on all of us and for all of us? Now, one of the problems with the notion of relevance, particularly in education, is that it's seen in relation to science. So science is seen what is relevant, so the idea you're curing cancer, you split atoms, you make cars work better, you make radios, you do all these things. And that somehow science is what contributes, and everything else, from sort of English literature through to sort of golf management, is somehow seen as kind of irrelevant and unimportant. But actually, what you learn at university is the ability to encounter information, analyse information, and use information. What you do in universities, they're places where you go on a journey of discovery of self and the world to develop and deploy knowledge and skills so that you can live and work, and you can prepare the next generation. That's what you do at university. And science, of course, is very important in one half of that. But on the other side of that, to understand the impact of science, to understand, for instance, that you're not only curing cancer, you're trying to understand what the impact of cancer is on the families that it attacks, to understand what grief means, to understand the importance of kindness in relation to care and health, to understand all those things. Those are not technical things. Those are other forms of understanding. They're not technical understandings. They're understandings of social, they're understandings that come through society, through social studies, through arts, and through humanities. So when we talk about relevance, which is extremely important part of this advocacy of universities, we have to understand that we're not necessarily just imparting knowledge, but crucially we're imparting skills and the ability to live and work in the new society. And just a particularly good example of this, the science thing is particularly interesting, I think, because if you take the relevant science axis too far, what you end up with is a kind of crude sort of instrumentalism, which then starts to put a time limit on how quickly the scientific discovery can make an impact, and that's how you kind of judge it. And of course what we know is that scientific discoveries take a long time to make an impact, I don't think it's it's after 12. So let's talk about Viagra. Now, the thing about Viagra, I don't want you to think that I've got any personal knowledge about this. I made a programme about Viagra, and everything I know about Viagra entirely comes from forms of academic and broadcasting research. What Viagra does, just for those of you that don't know, the way it works is that it elevates the level of a chemical in your body that relaxes the tissues and allows blood to flow. That's how it works. That's its mechanism, right? It needs a stimulant in order for that to work, but that's essentially what it does. It expands the capillary action and blood flows more quickly. And it came from, the drug was originally developed because in 1988, somebody won a Nobel Prize for looking at the relationship between nitric oxide and the relaxing of soft tissues, because they were studying angina. So it was related to heart disease. So they then got a group of men, and they gave them Viagra in order to see whether this had a positive effect on the symptoms of angina. What they discovered fairly swiftly was that it didn't have so much a positive effect on the symptoms of angina, but it did have a series of other effects. And the men went home skipping very, very happy, and actually doing things which probably led to them ultimately getting heart attacks. But nonetheless, and I always say about this drug is that it started, it's a typically male drug. It started being about the heart, and it went very quickly straight to the groin. So, but it took a long, long time through a series of iterations in order to get there, and actually rather beautifully. In 2006, a premature baby was born in Tyneside, and he was called Lewis Goodfellow. And he had a great deal of difficulty in breathing. His lungs were very badly affected. And what they did was they gave him a tiny amount of Viagra in order to bring his heart and lungs back into function. And he now lives a happy and successful young man in the northeast. And as I said to the surgeon who told me this story, it's a lovely journey from erection to resurrection. So, university's got to be relevant. They've also, we've got to make the case to students, potential students, I think, about making a positive choice to go to university. You don't just slide into university, and that's part of the problem in a sense. It's very much a middle-class thing. You kind of see it as a sort of, it's a route you go on. But actually, increasingly, it's not necessarily the best route for everybody. And the corollary of it is that actually I think the vocational education suffers as a result. But we've got to find some way of making that positive case. And if you think about your role within that, and now how young people choose the university they're going to, or whether they're going to go to university, the platforms that you build around the institutions that you're in are absolutely crucial to that process. How you appeal to them, the way that you appeal to them, they're on their own particular devices, tablets, iPhones, whatever the hell it is, the way in which you can start to use a platform to speak to those people is absolutely crucial. And the way in which you navigate that, the way in which you give them the tools to navigate that choice, it seems to me to be absolutely important. And the fourth thing which I just wanted to mention was that this notion of putting the student at the heart of the system, as government calls it. But essentially, it's this idea that what you do is you enhance the student experience. You put the student experience right in the middle of the way in which universities judge what it is they're doing. Now, I'm not necessarily saying, you have to be quite careful about this, because I'm not saying that students are necessarily consumers. The idea that students come along and they simply kind of they simply sort of choose what they want to do, and then they tell you what they want, as if somehow they've paid, it's a shop, they're going to get back what they've paid for. It's clearly a mistaken notion. And I have a friend who taught at Sussex, and he's a great expert on politics, particularly the political influence of the untouchables, as it happens in India. But he gave a lecture, his first lecture, and afterwards there were some complaints from kids who said it was just too difficult to keep up with. And he went back the second time, the second lecture, and he said, I understand there were some complaints, and people said that it was just too difficult to keep up with, there was too much information in there, and it was too complicated. Let me tell you this, he said, your job is to keep up with me. My job is not to lower myself to you. And at which point there were 200 very, very straight backs, and they sailed through the rest of the term. But that's the point about students. We put them at the centre of the experience, but you don't necessarily treat them as consumers. And that's really important, that how we balance the NSS and what it tells us about the way in which we can improve things, and the way in which we still say to students, look, we're still teaching you the same thing. In the old days, the professor sat on the metaphorical chair on high. He, normally, delivered from a position of authority information which you, the student, were then supposed to develop a critical attitude to. Now what happens is that students are swimming around in a cesspool of unverifiable information, also known as the internet, But what we have to do is we have to teach them that critical faculty. That's the crucial thing they must come out of university with, is that critical intelligence to decode, to validate, to understand, to reject dodgy information. And you clearly, in the way in which you design those systems, are absolutely crucial in that. And just a little sideline, I've done a couple of panels over the last 3 or 4 years, both of which was in Brighton. One of which was, the audience was a kind of bunch of what I call the boho Wi-Fi chic, really. The people who are saying, oh, ownership's all over, you know, it's all open access now, end of IP, you know, end of newspapers, you know, we'll validate the information ourselves, da-da-da-da-da. And I got absolutely pilloried for saying, well, I make my living through content, thank you very much, you know, and in my world it's called theft. No, that didn't go down with them at all well. Their idea was, you know, it was all open now and we're going to go to a whole new era. Where if you look at every single serious bit of use of the internet, it's underpinned in some way by validated information. Particularly if you look at the whole Edward Snowden, you know, WikiLeaks, da-da-da-da-da. None of that stuff actually exists in political debate and in terms of making change, other than it's supported in those cases by 2 newspapers, The Guardian and The New York Times. So this idea of validated information is increasingly important, it seems to me, in this cesspool of nonsense and the Kardashians and smiling cats. And secondly, the other thing is that when you look at the corporatization of the internet, actually people need to start understanding more and more and more their own particular power in that. And your ability to give them some power in that and encourage young people to take stewardship of the internet, whether that's about trying to start making some rules about what you do and don't say and questions of bullying, or whether it's on the other end of it, the way in which they understand what information they're giving to these huge corporates, the Googles, the Facebooks. That's very crucial, and you're absolutely at the centre of that. And it does make me, I mean, it kind of makes me laugh in a sort of grimace kind of way, that people go on and on and on about the NSA and GCHQ, when Google's business model is mass surveillance. That's what they do. And I'd much rather, in a way, I'd much rather the NSA personally and GCHQ were looking for movement in big data to find out whether somebody's about to blow me up, than the fact that actually I'm giving so much information to Facebook and Google accidentally on terms and conditions over which apparently I have no control whatsoever. I mean, which is the worst in a way? And you know, it's the old joke, isn't it, about Steve Jobs when he was alive, turned up at your front door on Christmas Day, you answer the door, he says, can I have your children? What do you mean, can I have my children? He says, it's in the terms and conditions. You know? So I just think we have to think a bit carefully, but you're really important, I think, to navigating our way through all that. So why does this have any bearing, or why does diversity have any bearing on any of these big questions that we've got to think about? I think it's this. I think it's because, to start, diversity has an inherent educational value. And I'd just like to quote, because he says it's so much better than anybody else, so rather than me doing it, paraphrasing it. It's a quote from a guy called Chris Brink. Is anybody here from Newcastle University? He's the Vice-Chancellor of Newcastle. He's an extraordinary bloke. He's a social scientist. He was the first post-apartheid Vice-Chancellor of Stellenbosch University, which many of you may know was the cradle of apartheid. It was where Milan and Verwoerd and all those leaders went in South Africa in the apartheid era. And Chris makes the point that all the way through the apartheid era, notwithstanding that they had to, in some ways, be part of that, universities were stridently independent about what they taught and who they admitted within the laws of the country. And they fought very hard for that. And Chris's point is that just because the government changed to a government which, broadly speaking, we were all in favour of, it didn't mean to say necessarily that universities should suddenly start doing what the government told them. Universities should remain beacons of independence, politically and intellectually. So when Chris was faced with transforming Stellenbosch into a multiracial university from a largely monoracial university, he had to find an educational reason to do it, and not just because the government says so. And so he said this about diversity, which underpinned the way in which he went about that. He said, diversity has an inherent educational value, and that's why we need more of it. The university is an educational institution, and our business is about knowledge. That means that we all have to learn. all the time. Students learn through their lectures, their assignments, their tutorials. Staff learn through their research, through their interaction with the community, and through their teaching. One way or another, we all have to learn and keep on learning, and we will learn from those people, those ideas, and those phenomena that we do not know than we will from those we know only too well. And I've always found, ever since I heard him say it, I found that a very inspiring notion, because that absolutely underpins the way in which diversity is absolutely central to education. So when we think back to those big questions about widening participation, about who the student population is, about how we navigate our way through those big challenges, that seems to me to be worth retaining in one's mind as a central reason to do it. There's an educational reason to do it. I think there's another prize, though, that diversity offers us. On the one hand, there are things that one would want to do in one's institution which are about providing very basic protections and encouragement to the breadth of talent in the institution. Just try something here. Just turn to your neighbour. Well, don't actually do it, but just think about turning to your neighbour and saying to your neighbour, I don't want you to succeed. It's almost impossible to do. Just look at them for a second. I don't want you to succeed. Now, we're not doing that personally. You're not doing that personally, but that's what we're doing institutionally. That's what we're saying in institutions when we say that there's 50-50% at entry-level men and women, and by the time it gets to professoriate, it's 80-20. Only 20% of the professoriate is female. That's what we're saying to black academics when we recognise that 10% of all working academics who are white are likely to become professors and do become professors. Of all the academics that are black that are working, 2% become professors. You're 5 times less likely to become a professor if you're black, British born. So we know there are persistent biases in all our institutions. We are not special in this. This is true across business and all organisations. And it's something we need to tackle. And we all want to tackle it because we want talent to flower and we want talent to rise and we want it to expand. And we don't want to be stuck in a situation where, particularly in universities, because it's all about talent and knowledge, and businesses, it's all about talent and knowledge. Why would we want to continue like that? So there's a job to be done just on the sort of 101 basic, let's make sure this happens kind of thing. Let's make sure that if there's racism or sexism or institutional racism or sexism, and I'm not talking about people being nasty, I'm talking about the way in which the institution ends up not promoting people. We need to tackle that. And we need to know that if there is active harassment or discrimination, we need to know there are transparent ways of sorting it out and people having access to some kind of recourse and fairness. We know that. 101, why wouldn't you want your university or department to be like that? That's important. I think there's another bigger prize, though, that comes from diversity. And it's this. And it's funny, when you work in diversity, as I do, you know, you often are faced with audiences, unlike this one, actually, which has a real balance in it, but business audiences, we're so often faced with almost entirely male audiences. And so I've taken to calling equality and diversity, now I call it equality and... Because they sort of drop off, these guys. You know, they kind of have a little snooze, because they just think, oh, dear, here we go again. You know, I'm going to be told off. You know, someone's going to wag the finger at me. It's all going to be very bad. I'm going to be told I'm a bloke, and then that's a bad thing, and so on and so forth. I don't think that at all. I don't wag my finger, and I don't think diversity is about that at all. Men also say, you know, they start talking about quotas, and they start talking about positive discrimination, and they get, you know, they get worried about it. And then they say things like, I wouldn't want to be on a board just because I was a woman. And I always say to them, well, think about it, but you may well find you're on a board just because you're a man. Because the networks you're in, the advantage you had, the culture in your organisation enables that progress in a way that demonstrably it doesn't appear to enable it for women. And I always say that the KPI for diversity, my current one, is that we will have truly cracked this diversity question when we appoint a truly mediocre woman to a seriously top job. So, if you could just write that down and see if you can achieve that soon, I'd be very grateful about that. So look, but where does this get us? Here's the important thing. Here's the important thing. Very little of what you do in your day-to-day work, you do on your own. Almost everything you do is done with other people, is done collaboratively, is done with teams. There's a kind of heroism about, you know, the way in which change happens and so on and so forth. The great CEO who comes in. And of course, good leaders come in and they change the temperature, they change the direction. But they only do it because they work collaboratively with the whole institution. And we know perfectly well, particularly in universities, it's the opposite. I mean, if you're in Waitrose, and I always pick Waitrose in front of a university audience, because I know you're all going to Little now, I know, but, you know, I always like to pick Waitrose just to make you feel you're in the right company. So, did you see that great site that Waitrose did that then got taken over? I just love this. I love Waitrose because they tried to get it going and they wanted people to put on the thing that stuff they'd overheard. Stuff they'd overheard people say in Waitrose. And the two best ones were, one was, I love Waitrose because, and they'd heard someone say, Alexander, put down that kumquat, which... But the absolute best one, which is that you couldn't write this stuff out. There was a man heard to shout to his wife across the aisle. He said, "Darling, do we have enough pesto for both houses?" Couldn't write it, could you? It's so fabulous. When Waitrose want to go into avocados, what they do is they do a simple calculation. It's complex in its detail, but it's basically a simple idea. They look at supply chains, they look at product, they look at stuff they could make, they look at the public's appetite for it. They do a series of things and say, look, if we get the avocados, turn them into a product, will the public buy them at this price, can we make money? Relatively simple. Universities don't work like that at all. Universities are very shallow, very long-based triangles in which nothing happens unless it flows up from that base, out of the intellectual imagination of academics and others who work in the institution. That's how it works, and it's a relatively short space between the base of the triangle and the apex. So it's even more important in institutions, in higher education institutions, universities, to work in teams and to generate that kind of collaborative approach, whether it's in research, whether it's in teaching, whether it's in IT, whether it's changing the institution and the culture within it. So if teams are so important, an interesting question then would be, how do we put together the best teams? The teams that have, if you like, the highest intelligence, by which I mean the ability to tackle complex problems to the highest possible level of performance. Well, some very interesting research done by led by two particular people, one called Chris Chabris and one called Laura Woolley in the States at MIT. And what they looked at was that question, do teams have a single intelligence? And if so, can we measure it? And interestingly, to the first question, they came up with the answer, probably yes. And to the second question, they came up with an answer which said probably what it looks like is that the high-performing teams have three key characteristics. One is they have a diversity of approach, of heuristic, of discipline. So, if you like, ways in which you tackle the problems. Secondly, they probably have a diversity of background, of heritage, of culture, of difference that they bring to that team. And the third thing is that the team can manage the conflict and differences that arise as a result of the first two. Because the thing about diversity, it's much more difficult to manage than homogeneity. It's much easier to organise 12 hard-hatted lesbians to go in the same direction than it is to organise a whole variegated bunch of people. And I use them merely because one would instinctively use the 12 middle-aged white pinstripe men. But it's the same thing. If you have homogenous groups with groupthink, they go very well. They move very easily in the right direction, and they're easy to manage. You set up this diversity in a team, it's intensely difficult to manage, and it gives you long-term benefits, not short-term benefits, so you have to understand how to manage it. So if that's true, if teams have an intelligence, and if that's what dictates the intelligence of those teams, then what you would always do is recruit to those teams. And my favourite book on this subject is a book called The Difference by a guy called Scott E. Page. And he started looking at simulations of how people behaved in economies. And he started to recognise that there was this peculiar thing emerging out of his research, which is the randomly selected individuals, agents within this experiment, performed a whole lot better than the specially selected ones of the best kind of people. And he got very intrigued by this, and it turned into a 10-year research project. And what he did was he set out to test the theory that diversity trumps ability. he puts a couple of conditions on it. One is that they have the relevant skills within the team. So if you're going to build a house, and you're going to be after, you need to know what load-bearing beams are, you need to know flying buttresses. If you're going to be a team of doctors, you need to know how to put in a heart, take in a liver, whatever it is. You need that level of technical skill. But beyond that, what you need above anything else is levels of diversity. We did some work with one of the big technology companies. And there's an exercise you can do where you can put people on a spectrum. And you get entrepreneurs at one end, you get the consolidators at the other end. And in this particular place, because they're all trendy boho Wi-Fiers, they all stood up the entrepreneur end. And as they were standing at the entrepreneur end, they were sort of looking down the other end of the room, and there was no one there. And one of them said almost under his breath, he went, "Oh, that's why we never get anything done." Now, we sort of know that, don't we? We sort of know that. I mean, look, I was going to use the analogy of a football team. What do I know about football? You know, it's the gay gene kicks in at this point. You know, we don't care about the game, but we love the legs. But you know, I don't know. When anybody says about Manchester United, I'm always tempted to say, "Is that hockey?" You know, just to sort of throw the assumption that it's football, you know, because I can't bear all that. But anyway, you wouldn't make a football team all of goalies. You know, we know all that, but we don't do it. We don't do it. What we do is we do this thing, we get the best person for the job. If there's one thing I want you to take away today, if you'd be kind enough, don't appoint the best person for the job. I'll say that again. Don't appoint the best person for the job. Now, I know it sounds counterintuitive, but if you just appoint the best person for the job, what you end up with is the RBS board. Because what you've done is you've gone round and you've got the best person in the sector, lawyer, accountant, da-da-da-da-da, the best non-exec directors around. You will find that what you've actually done is appoint a homogenous group of people. Don't appoint the best person for the job. Appoint the best team for the job. So when you appoint people, don't look at them in relation to the person spec individually. Look at them in relation to each other and the team you've already got. What have I got? What do I need? What will I recruit? And follow that logic. Always put together teams. Don't put together the best people for the job, because in the end, all they'll do is think very, very similarly. So, just in how you do that, actually, there is something, we're developing a tool at the moment, and it is this crucial difference between comparing the person with the job spec, or the person spec, and comparing what you've got available with the range of what you've already got and what you need. And most HR processes don't encourage you to do that. That's why I'm mentioning it, because a lot of the stuff is, instinctively, this is what you want to do, but the way in which the process drives you will be in the opposite direction. You will be driven to recruit in this way. Resist it if you can, and start to look at the system. So when you put together your IT teams and your departments, start to think differently, and for God's sake, have some flatfoots in there. You know, entrepreneurs, have some consolidators in there. Make sure you've got a mix, and make sure you encourage that debate, open it up. And you'll have to learn, that's the thing about diversity, is you have to learn to allow the debate absolutely to open it up, but everybody has to be perfectly clear that at some stage it's got to close down to a conclusion. So diversity doesn't just kind of flow in a sort of unstructured way. It's got to enable to open up, but it's got to close down. And that's where your leadership comes in as head of departments and head of teams and directors of IT. It's your ability to open up the imagination, but also close it down to a solution. So in its broadest sense, I suppose, this whole exercise really has an educational reason that lies at the heart of it, which is this idea that diversity is in itself the core of what we need in the education experience. But in order to tackle these massive problems, these massive, not problems, challenges, some of which I started talking about at the beginning, you will need the broadest range of imagination and the broadest range of experience and ability and heritage and background within those teams in order to make some real sense of it. And I always say, in a kind of a way of just remembering this, I suppose, is that if you're going to teach an English seminar and you're studying D.H. Lawrence, actually it's more interesting to have the gamekeeper in the seminar along with Lady Chatterley. And at the moment, what we have in our students is a lot of filladers and very few gamekeepers. So that diversity sits right at the centre of it. And just a final quote, really, which is from the Vice-Chancellor of Sheffield, Keith Burnett, who I asked when we were working there. As I say, we're doing this big project, which we start next week, which is the next phase of the project that we did with Chris and others, which is we're doing a project with 200 senior academics at Sheffield, and we're going to develop the educational rationale for Sheffield for diversity, and what that means in terms of how they change, how they recruit, how they put together research teams, etc., etc., etc. And actually, just in brackets, it's a very good time to start talking about this, because the ref is all but done. You know, it'll be submitted, you know, at the end of the year. We've got the biggest window until that next huge pressure appears. So you've got the biggest window now to start experimenting and changing the way in which you recruit and looking for potential as well as actual experience. So let me just quote you this Keith Burnett quote. He said, "I've seen the growth of several exciting areas of science in my career. In my experience, the most intellectually adventurous areas draw in the widest range of people. It reinforces the notion that creativity is one of the most broadly based of human attributes, no respecter of class or kin. I've sometimes observed that the least established or most pioneering fields are places where the greatest courage is needed for their pursuit. Having the courage to push through perceived barriers, received wisdoms, or challenging expectations to achieve something regardless, requires a determination which is frequently found in those who've had to show these same qualities in other ways. People of talent and stamina exist in all backgrounds, but those who've overcome the possibility of discrimination in their own lives have often shown that these very qualities come into play to take the intellectual risk that real advances demand." It's another way of looking at why diversity is so powerful, particularly in that educational context. So just really to leave you with that thought, always build teams, don't recruit individuals, and make diversity your weapon of choice. Thank you very much indeed for listening.